The calm before the storm. Morning came early for these American pilots based in, awaiting their next mission.
All right, you guys. Breakfast at 3, briefing at 4.
February 3rd, 1945. You know, it was my 40th mission, so it's just like any other mission. You don't know what the target is until they wake you up around midnight or 2 in the morning to study the target. So
4 a.m. Just before takeoff, this is revealed. The target for the 8th American Air Force that day was Berlin.
I knew that anytime you go to Berlin, there's a special mission. If we knocked out all the buildings that the German high command were occupying, including Hitler's place, wherever that happened to be, that it would cause a big disruption.
In some parts of the city, the target had already been reduced to rubble. Berliners coped as best they could in the ruins of their houses, in a constant state of emergency. Hardly a day or night went by without an air raid. The fear, hour after hour, can be seen in painful clarity on this air tour.
You lived from day to day, from one war to the next, and you were glad each time you survived the bombs that fell. And the Berliners had a special way of saying goodbye to each other. Make sure you're left over, because nobody ever knew if they'd make it through the next raid. There was a frenzied will to stay alive, in a world of death and rubble, of horror and the terror of final collapse.
Und dieser Welt der Trümmer und des Schreckens und des Horrors und des Zusammenbruchs.
While Berlin was still recovering from the last attack, the US Air Force was preparing to strike the next blow. This raid would make all previous assaults seem relatively mild. And it would mark a fundamental change in American tactics.
that was a special mission for us, because normally we were bombing strategic targets of, you know, synthetic oil, aerodromes, aircraft factories. But this is the first time that we really were involved in bombing a city where all the key buildings were in the middle of town. That was a brand new experience for us.
In the carpet bombing of German cities, the prelude to the Flight Offensive, almost 1,000 bombers took to the sky.
The
Americans flew in rigid formations, as if they were in a parade. And of course, for a 15-year-old boy who had been brought up in the Nazi regime and therefore naturally wanted a German victory, well, of course it made you doubt whether the German armed forces had any chance of dealing with the threat in view of the vast superiority of the enemy forces.
But not everyone dreaded the American bombers. Sometimes they were seen from concentration camps.
They flew over us in Sachsenhausen, and basically we were pleased. I can say that in all honesty. We were pleased that they came over and dropped their bombs, because we would say to each other, this means the war will be over all the sooner.
10:39. The air raid sirens sounded in Berlin. In the Air Defense Center, there was no longer any doubt. The capital was the target. The anti-aircraft batteries were alerted.
Achtung, Achtung! Luftklare Meldung vom Divisionsgefechtsstand. Eine Welle der feindlichen Flugzeuge hat die Flakzone erreicht und wird durch Flakartillerie bekämpft.
At times we would be going up 3 or 4 times a night, So we ended up not even getting out of our uniforms when we got back down from the anti-aircraft battery. We'd just put our helmets on the shelf, take off our coats and lie down on the bed. Mind you, it generally didn't take long before the alarm went off again. We'd grab our helmets and race up to the guns again like maniacs. I actually had the impression they were coming over whenever they wanted. Sometimes there'd be a lot of them, sometimes not many. They'd drop their bombs and we couldn't do a thing to stop them.
The skies over Berlin belonged to the Allies, and they believed they had right on their side.
We were excited because it was an opportunity to really do something we hoped to shorten the war.
10:50. The bunkers and air raid shelters started filling up. Life on the streets came to a standstill. The people running for cover didn't yet know if the raid would hit their district, or if it was a false alarm.
It was a Saturday in February, the 3rd of February. The sun was shining, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Ideal flying weather. At about 10 o'clock, the sirens went off. My mother took me down to the cellar, which was what we always did. Those air raids had simply become a fact of life. But of course, when they came, you still got very scared.
11:02. The first wave of bombers reached the target area. The distinctive circle of Belle Alliance Platz in the Kreuzberg district helped them get their bearings. Visibility was excellent.
We had pictures of the city. We knew exactly where it was. With this lead crew squadron, they studied that stuff all the time, so we knew what Berlin like the back of your hand.
11:05. The first bombs were dropped.
Try to keep your bombs as close to the target as possible. And in the case of Berlin, we knew there would be other damage because our bomb patterns were pretty big. It was pretty somber because we knew that we were bombing in the heart of the city.
From so high above Berlin, it was impossible to judge the impact of this hail of bombs on the people on the ground.
I had never thought a cellar could move up and down like a ship on the high seas. The floor was forced upwards and then down, and it ended up with all of us, my mother, all the adults, the children and the adolescents, everyone in the cellar, pressing ourselves against the cellar floor in absolute terror.
Wir drückten uns in diesen Kellerboden hinein vor schrecklicher Angst.
Even the strongest cellar became a death trap if fire and rubble blocked the only way out.
I never believed I would get out of that cellar alive. But it wasn't that I panicked and thought, oh my God, now my life is over. It was more a case of thinking, oh well, that's that, I suppose. And while I was in a sort of daze, all of a sudden, there was this banging sound. And the rescue service people knocked a hole in the wall. And then I heard someone calling out my name. Well, I thought I was dreaming. But I made my way through to the front cellar and saw people already crawling out. It wasn't level ground, so you had to sort of crouch down and climb out. That's how everyone got out. There was a young woman with 2 small children, and I took one of them for her. So we got back up to the surface thinking we'd been rescued, and we found ourselves surrounded by buildings that were all on fire.
Incendiary bombs set fire to the part of Berlin where the government and administration buildings were situated. Those who managed to escape from the falling buildings found themselves encircled by towering walls of flame.
Well, afterwards we went out into the street, and it was only then that we realized what a disaster had happened to us. The sky wasn't blue anymore. The fires made it completely black. It was as dark as night. You couldn't see a thing. It was as dark as night. You really have the feeling it's the end of the world when you come out of a house in the morning and the sky is black. The sun had vanished, although it had been there just a couple of hours earlier. It really was like the end of the world, especially because you knew the future would be even worse.
The raid lasted under an hour. 25,000 people died, including the dreaded Nazi judge Roland Freisler, who had persecuted the plotters who had attempted to assassinate Hitler. Bombs cannot distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Did the airmen feel pity?
No. No, I didn't. If I'd have been feeling sorry for him, I couldn't have done my job like I did. No, you know, after things over, you could have a different view of it.
11:52. The tide of bombers left behind a smoking wasteland. Never before had Berlin been so badly hit.
The whole building had toppled over into the street, and the roof was on its side, in flames. We had to get past it to get to safety. And I was screaming like I don't know what, saying I wouldn't go through there. And then a young man appeared, suddenly standing in front of me, and he asked my mother where she was going. She said she wanted to get through to Sebastianstrasse. So the young man said, "Come with me, you take your suitcase, and I'll carry the little boy, and I'll get you through." And he lifted me up into his arms and carried me through. Not far from where I live, there's a church, and a painter from Kreuzberg has painted a Madonna standing in a blazing inferno with a little blonde child in her arms. My Madonna was a man.
An unsung hero in a world of devastation. A blanket of destruction covered the entire center of Berlin. The war reached a new level of suffering here.
Of course, there were dead bodies, all piled up. Sometimes it was as though... Sometimes I think, when I look back at that period, I just didn't have the time to weep.
As the days passed, hope of finding more survivors in the rubble gradually faded.
On the second day, my mother took me with her when she took my father a pot of coffee. He'd been working for 2 days without a break, without coming home. When we got there, he told us they'd been listening again that day, and they'd heard a very faint sort of whimpering sound. So they started digging again, trying to get closer. And it turned out there was a little girl about 3 or 4 years old, still alive in the cellar. She'd been trapped underneath a beam that had protected her in the end. She was lying there, crying with thirst and fear and whatever, and they got her out. She was the only one alive from 80 people down there.
But in an attempt to save lives, the regime also endangered the very people it had already robbed of all human rights.
The bombs that hadn't gone off had to be dug out somehow. They used prisoners for that work, lots of them, and very, very many of them went up in smoke with the bombs they dug out. I was one of them, usually the youngest, digging to get the bombs out. And that feeling, when you hit a bomb with your spade and felt it sliding along the casing, well, it did send shivers up and down your spine.
These are the pictures of a country that was, in many ways, already devastated. It was now just a matter of time before Hitler's war ended in defeat. In the last year of the war alone, Allied bombs did greater damage than in all the other years put together. Entire cities were reduced to debris. Just before the end, even towns that had previously been spared, like Würzburg, became unrecognizable. Worst hit was Düren in Westphalia, which, after the raid, was almost completely obliterated. What was the thinking behind the Allied strategy of imposing such destruction?
They thought that by hitting at the cities, they would discourage the Germans from the war and, of course, do damage to German morale and the ability and willingness to continue the war.
But this was a miscalculation. Preoccupation with staying alive from one day to the next reinforced a widespread, stubborn indifference.
You felt really shaken for a while each time. And of course you were also terribly afraid each time. And every day you were faced with terrible sights. There was all of that. But what the British wanted people to feel, that didn't happen.
Es geht alles vorüber, es geht alles vorbei. Auf jeden Dezember folgt wieder ein Mai.
But it would be 10 long weeks before spring came.
People get used to war faster than you might think, and then a very curious mood takes over, almost a kind of indifference. I never saw people screaming, I really didn't, even though the casualties were high, very high. It's a kind of, how shall I put this, a kind of euphoria that grips you when you know you survived.
Thousands of air raid victims lost their homes, literally overnight. But the sense that everyone was suffering brought people closer together.
It wasn't just us, you see. I mean, if it had been just our home that was bombed in the whole of Berlin, if we'd been the unlucky ones, then we'd have said, this is terrible, why us? But everyone was in the same boat, weren't they?
The government knew exactly how to encourage this attitude.
When you came up from the cellars, there would be a sort of a field kitchen there, serving pea soup. Nobody asked who you were, everyone got some. It was an excellent piece of organisation. It was during those times that a real feeling of national spirit developed, though the expression is awful. And people whose homes were still intact would take in families who had been made homeless, who were on the streets, just like that.
Dr. Goebbels überreicht besonders bewährten Kämpfern gegen den verbrecherischen Bombenterror Auszeichnungen.
The hour of the demagogue had arrived. Goebbels' propaganda machine did everything it could to transform bitterness into the will to fight on.
So werden unsere Städte und Dörfer auch unter dem britisch-amerikanischen Bombenterror ungebeugt bleiben. Der Feind kann unsere Häuser in Schutt und Asche verwandeln. Die Herzen der Bevölkerung brennen dabei vor Hass, aber sie verbrennen nicht. Eines Tages kommt die Stunde der Vergeltung.
The V-2 rockets were launched. These so-called miracle weapons were supposed to turn the tide of war. Antwerp, the chief port of Belgium. Following the withdrawal of the German forces of occupation, it became an important supply port for the Allies. By the spring of 1945, the city was a principal target for German missiles.
You never knew when they would come, so we lived in constant fear. When we went to bed at night, we just hoped none of them would come over.
Flying bombs and missiles were causing havoc at a time when there were no German bomber planes left. In Liège and Antwerp alone, the constant barrage claimed the lives of 6,500 people. There was no warning and no defense. It was impossible to predict where they would fall, and their impact was terrible. An attack horrified everyone who witnessed it.
Roef, alles kapot.
Bang. Everything destroyed. People in the street all went running towards the house, screaming and yelling. The two youngest daughters had been asleep. They suffocated. Otherwise they weren't harmed at all. They just suffocated. It was a terrible catastrophe. Terrible. In less than a minute, everything was gone.
In een minuut, ja. Je zit dan maar pas weg.
The bomb hit a row of houses near Antwerp, killing an entire family with the exception of the eldest son, who survived because he wasn't at home that night.
You're left in your trousers and your jacket, and apart from that, everything you had is simply gone. The people you grew up with, people you were so close to, everything has vanished. And all you can see is a pile of rubble. Everything's buried underneath that.
This was the reality of the miracle weapon, in a war where there was nowhere left to hide. Dresden, the capital of Saxony on the River Elbe, was still largely intact at the beginning of 1945, even though the Allies had already crossed Germany's western border. The Baroque city boasted a wealth of cultural and architectural treasures and appeared to have been spared the air raids. The inhabitants kept their spirits up with hopeful speculation.
There were all sorts of fairy tales flying around to explain why the city wouldn't be bombed. Because Churchill had an aunt living there. Because it was a Baroque city. Because of all the art treasures there, and so on. But in the end we just got used to the fact and said to ourselves, all right, we're lucky. Nothing's going to happen to us.
Dresden was no oasis of peace. The war took its toll here too, but people tried to stay cheerful. Even the Sarasani circus, which was based in the city, was still performing at the beginning of 1945.
The performances are all very well attended, and that surprised me. In fact, because the main performances were all in the evening, you see. And despite all the air raid warnings, people would come out of their homes and go to the circus.
Vielen Fliegeralarm aus ihren Wohnungen weg sind und sind dann in den Zirkus gegangen.
Ingeborg's partner and the father of her little boy was a Chinese circus acrobat. Inside the circus, Otong was a celebrity, but outside, his movements were limited because the racial doctrines of the Nazis made him an outcast. His partner suffered bitter experience of this.
Dann haben sie mich verhaftet und dann haben sie mir die Haare ab.
They arrested me, and then they shaved my head. Then they put a sign round my neck. Written on it, at the front and at the back, was, "I am a foreigner's whore." Then they sent me out to walk through the streets for 2 hours.
Pilloried, because love defies racism. This is a photograph from Dresden.
What did I do wrong? I never harmed anyone. I never did anything to anyone.
Bin niemandem etwas schuldig geblieben.
And, as in the other cities of Hitler's Germany, behind the glittering facade of Dresden, there was contempt for human life and systematic terror. Dresden's Jews had already been marched off to the death camps. Early in 1945, the noose began to tighten for those of the city's inhabitants who had one Jewish parent.
Als ich den Bescheid bekam, dass ich am 15. Februar...
When I received notification that I had to report to an office on 15th of February, I thought to myself, oh well, you'll just have to go, like your sister. But I didn't realize that this was the beginning of rounding up the half-Jews, so they could be taken away, to be destroyed. There was the threat of transportation, and transportation meant death.
Zur Vernichtung transportiert zu werden. Es wurde der Abtransport und Abtransport hieß eben Tod.
For most Dresdeners, this threat was an abstract concept. The local Nazi party leaders did all they could to promote a false sense of security. Hardly any measures had to protect the population of the city in the event of an air raid. There were no bomb-proof shelters, except for Herr Mutschmann, the Gauleiter of Dresden. In the cellar of his official residence, Hitler's governor of Dresden had installed a bomb-proof bunker, the only one in the city. The Florence on the Elbe was not solely due to its cultural heritage. The city was an important hub of Germany's road and rail network. It was also a garrison city, and every day many soldiers passed through. At the station they met thousands of refugees seeking shelter in Dresden. They were fleeing the advance of the Red Army into Silesia.
At 9 in the evening, we got 750 refugees from Breslau. Women, children, old people. There were 65 babies. And we had our hands full dealing with them. Everyone who saw them would say, my God, the border. The front is getting closer and closer to us. What's going to happen to us over the next few weeks and months?
The Red Army was closing in fast from the east. In early February, the Soviet winter offensive brought Stalin's forces to the River Elbe, just over 90 miles from Dresden. The Allies met at Yalta and made preparations for the last great strike against Germany. In order to support the Soviet offensive, the Western powers agreed to extend the war in the air and intensify the bombing, particularly of those cities close to Germany's eastern front. The possibility of this operation had existed for some time. Years before, British Bomber Command had drawn up a list of German cities to be targeted. The Americans and the British now agreed that one of these cities should be moved to the top of the list: Dresden. On the 13th of February 1945, the Allied decision was issued to Bomber Command. The pilots involved did not learn about it until their briefing later in the day.
And then when you saw your name on the operations board and your stomach, your heart drops into your boots, and then you think, well, we've been lucky before, perhaps we'll be lucky again. And Dresden was my 31st operation.
It was just before takeoff that many pilots heard the word Dresden, the identity of their target, for the first time. They were also told the justification for the attack.
The intelligence officer said that the great amounts of armaments were moving up through Dresden up to face the Russian front, because they knew that the spring offensive would soon be launched. And he told us, we don't know a great deal of what else is in Dresden, but the Germans consider it a safe city. And there is a lot of the administration has been moved to Dresden.
The crews took to the air thinking they were about to attack a target of strategic importance. In the city, no one had any idea of the approaching danger. And the 13th of February was Carnival Tuesday, an opportunity for a little fun amid the daily grind of war.
Childhood was pretty bleak for us, so why shouldn't we be allowed to put on fancy dress for once and have a good time? I can remember how we celebrated Carnival, my friends and I. We went out in the streets.
The uneventful day was drawing to a close. In the city centre, Ingeborg Tung said goodbye to her partner. That night, he had to go out.
Ich bin mit ihm zur Straßenbahnhaltestelle.
I walked with him to the tram stop, and he took me in his arms and held me tight, really tight. I could hardly breathe. It was as though he sensed something would happen. Look after yourself, and look after the boy, he said. I said, I'll take care, don't worry. And anyway, you'll be back tomorrow.
Pass auf den Jungen auf, ich sagte, ich werde schon aufpassen. Hab keine Angst und morgen kommst du wieder.
But by the next day, nothing in Dresden would ever be the same again. Just after 10 o'clock that evening, the radio announced formation of enemy bombers approaching the city. For the crews of the Lancaster bombers of the first wave, who had completed a 9-hour flight without incident, this was the decisive moment.
We're approaching Dresden, and about 10 miles beforehand, the cloud broke. And we went out of cloud and water relief because we were exactly in the position on time.
They dropped their bombs exactly as planned.
It didn't take long before you could hear the bombs dropping, and that's a sound you never forget. It sounded as though potatoes were being dropped out of a bag, or coal or something, but it went on without a break, absolutely without a break.
Wurden Kartoffeln ausgeschüttet oder Kohlen oder so, ununterbrochen, aber ununterbrochen.
Was ich heute noch irgendwie
The thing I can hardly believe now, looking back, is that we made fun of other people. The bombs were falling, and the ones who were moaning loudest, whimpering and praying and so on, were the Nazis. And of course, they weren't very friendly to us. They were the ones who moaned loudest. But later, when it got really critical, we stopped talking too.
Aber dann, wo es kritisch wurde, haben wir auch nicht mehr gesagt.
Wir saßen da in dem eingerichteten Luftschutzraum.
We were sitting there in an air raid shelter. It was very quiet. Nobody said a word. There was a candle burning on the table, and I was trembling all over.
Die Kerze brannte auf dem Tisch, und ich zitterte an allen.
The people were looking at me, and someone told my mother she should take care of me, but my mother was petrified. She couldn't move a muscle.
Kümmern Sie sich doch Ihre Tochter. Aber meine Mutter war so versteinert, sie konnte sich nicht rühren.
Lit up by signal flares, Christmas trees, the Germans nicknamed them, the centre of the city was the drop zone for 2,656 tons of bombs. Within minutes, the old town was completely ablaze.
Ja, du musst leben, du hast das Kind.
You have to stay alive. You have a child. Yes, that's what I was thinking. When I came running out of the house and tried to get away, a man came racing after me and pulled my coat off my back. I was on fire. I'd run through the phosphorus. My shoes were burning, my hair was burning, my coat, everything was on fire. There was fire everywhere, from down on the ground to up in the sky. It was incredible. The man said, "You're burning all over." I hadn't noticed, because the whole street was burning.
Ich hab das nicht gespürt. Denn die ganze Straße brannte.
The heat of the fire was so intense that it even melted glass.
Und dann der Feuersturm. Funke an Funke.
And then came the firestorm. flashing along with such amazing speed. It swept through the streets like an inferno. You can't imagine it.
Unvorstellbar. Es ist eigentlich ein Wunder, dass man da...
It really was a miracle that anyone escaped without going up like a burning torch. A miracle, really.
Es ist wirklich ein Wunder.
Meanwhile, Red Cross nurse Helga Sievers had found a temporary shelter for her refugees in the cellar of a school. But this building too started to burn.
Ich bin runter. I went down to the cellar and I was thinking to myself, now what? What am I going to do with these 750 people? So I made a speech. I said to them, listen to me. We have to get out of this cellar. The building above us is on fire. There is no immediate danger because it's only burning from the 3rd floor, but we can't wait much longer. We have to get out so we don't suffocate.
So the nurse had to find another shelter for her refugees.
There was a rescue centre with a doctor on duty. I went along there and told him I'd have to take my refugees down into the cellar. And the doctor held out his arms like a policeman, blocking my path. And he said, nobody's coming in here. This is only for the wounded. So I said, oh, I see. We just have to wait until we're wounded, and then we'll be allowed in. I really lost my temper with him. I told him the people had to be allowed down into the cellar. So then I was allowed to put them there. 750 people crammed into the corridors of the cellar.
Thanks to her courage, all the refugees in this cellar survived. But other buildings became death traps.
Some of the people in the cellar had been burned to death, or they'd suffocated. The bodies had been brought out. And I saw one thing at the side of the road I've never been able to get out of my mind. There was a woman standing there with a pram, and a baby in the pram. And they were both dead. They'd suffocated. But the woman was still standing there, as if she was waiting to push her pram across the street. I couldn't go any further. I couldn't stand it.
After that night, death was everywhere, in many different guises. The annihilation of Dresden continued the following morning with the arrival of 311 American flying fortresses shortly after 12 o'clock. The city was left a pile of rubble, a cemetery concealing tens of thousands of bodies. The face of Dresden was no longer recognizable. All life in the center had been extinguished. What did the attackers feel?
I couldn't spare any regrets for Dresden or any other German target. The whole war was one big regret, wasn't it? It's unfortunate, but it happened. If the Germans had been able to get here and take us over, what would have been the lives of the people over here then? Would we have been in concentration camps? Would we be an under-nation? Would the Germans be the master race? These were uppermost in my mind when thinking about it.
And yet, the sheer extent of the devastation caused even Allied politicians to suffer doubt. Kenneth Galbraith was commissioned by the American government to assess the assault.
The enormous cruelty of that attack on Dresden when the war was already won, for example, and the loss of life of children, women, civilians was very serious and served no purpose.
Even Churchill, who had ordered the attack, now distanced himself from it. The question of the bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Otherwise, we shall come into control of an utterly ruined land. The British Prime Minister's insight came too late for the city on the Elbe. Decades would pass before Dresden could be rebuilt and re-establish the links with its traditions. And yet, for some people, the destruction of Dresden was their salvation.
Als der Angriff vorbei war,
when the attack was over and my thoughts were on other things, like getting water and so on, I suddenly remembered that I was supposed to report to that office on the 15th, which was only 2 days away. But everything had been destroyed, the trams and everything. And anyway, nobody knew whether I was still alive. So I said to myself, just don't bother going. Anyway, some of the files had been destroyed by the Gestapo. So I thought, well, maybe you'll get through this after all.
Dann gedacht, na ja, nu kommst du vielleicht so durch.
The days of Hitler's dictatorship were numbered. In April 1945, the Red Army pushed forward to the River Oder. The Allies had long enjoyed air supremacy over Germany. The Luftwaffe was in no position to mount any opposition.
Naturally, we realized things were no longer the way they had been at the start, when one success followed another. We had serious problems, and our losses were mounting steadily. Of course, you started to have doubts, but there was no alternative. You had to carry on. There was no backing out.
In the air, it was open season for long-range Allied aircraft hunting German fighters, if they got off the ground at all.
One time, our squadron was attacked on the ground here in Brockheide by Mustangs taken by surprise. By a miracle, we didn't lose any personnel. There we were, waiting on standby, and when the Mustangs saw a whole squadron lined up on the tarmac, they just turned the place into a fireworks display. That day, about 50 of our fighters were destroyed.
The Luftwaffe were not the only victims of Allied air superiority. Low-flying planes strafed everything that moved.
We were always trying to shoot up railroads. Well, we just didn't want them to move. In the same way with convoys of trucks. They just wanted to stop everything that moved.
Every journey, every movement meant danger, even for civilians.
You jumped
down from the vehicle where you were sitting and tried to take cover in a ditch, behind a tree, anywhere you could find, even just behind bushes. You did your best to keep out of sight and range of the low-flying planes, but one time they'd come from behind, the next from ahead. It was unpredictable and really terrible.
This is the end of a journey through the ruined country. The threat was ever present, in a hail of bombs in the city, but also in the countryside. For German fighter pilots, the situation was virtually hopeless.
That was the first time it really occurred to me how small Germany had become. They'd already reached the Elbe, and the Russians, what more did they want? We were already finished off. What on earth were we supposed to use to turn the tide at that stage?
Yet the fighter pilots were still sent up to provide air defense. In order to make any impact at all, it was decided that the pilots should ram Allied aircraft and then bail out. It was hoped they would parachute to safety. But in the end, this ramming tactic was also applied to targets on the ground. In effect, pilots were ordered to commit suicide.
The Russians have reached the Oder, and there's only one way to stop them. By destroying all the bridges across the river with one blow. And that is only possible if pilots are prepared to sacrifice themselves. I felt rather apprehensive the first time I had to make that appeal.
Ich habe mit ziemlicher Beklemmung diesen Aufruf bekannt geben müssen.
Some of the pilots who volunteered only discovered at the last minute what their real mission entailed. Men like Erich Kreil.
Und dann sagt
And then he said self-sacrifice. Well, you could have heard a penny drop. It was that quiet. We were shocked, I can tell you. Really shocked. At the last minute, just before you climb into the plane, knowing you're about to die.
Noch nicht drin in der Maschine und wissen, du stirbst gleich.
Then each of them had to write a farewell letter, write out his will and pack his things. All the possessions he had with him, and a hand in his kit bag, which would later be sent off to his relatives.
There was just enough time to write a last letter to their families.
Alles Gute.
I wrote, all the best, keep your spirits up. A few lines. I don't remember what exactly. I was in a state of shock myself. What are you going to do now?
Ja.
A sobering farewell. Last preparations were made for the beginning of an insane mission.
I didn't really start to think straight till I was up in the air. When I was by myself, I kept on thinking, this is madness. For a bridge? For a bomb on a bridge, you're supposed to sacrifice your own life?
Suicide missions against temporary bridges that the Soviet troops could rebuild within hours. This was one of the worst manifestations of madness in the final days of the war.
Well, it was getting closer and closer. An awful feeling. I banked and started to dive. And as I was diving, I was thinking to myself, no, you're going to pull up, no matter what happens. You're not going to dive straight into it. I dropped the bomb, pulled out of the dive and headed west. I was telling myself, no, you're going home.
Du fliegst nach Hause.
Erich Kreil owes his life to his spontaneous refusal to obey orders. The vast majority of the pilots who took off that day, about 36 of them, did not return.
The Russians are coming became a cry of fear among the Germans in the east in 1945 as the Red Army made its unstoppable advance. Hitler's war continues at the same time tomorrow on History, where next archaeologists uncover a Greek railway built in the 6th century BC in Ancient Discoveries.